Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about elevating the jet upset training gold standard, and we'll be presenting the Every Pilot in Control UPRT Mastery Program by Aviation Performance Solutions. It's an exciting program that has tiered approaches to mitigating the risk of loss of control in flight, but most importantly, the solutions have to be designed around what, where, and how you operate. Let's jump into it. So we have an exciting panel of speakers today, everybody, where we're going to be talking about the UPRT Mastery Program. We're going to be approaching it with starting with introductions to the team that I'll bring in here in just a minute. Then we're going to talk about the why behind having a UPRT Mastery Program. But today we're going to be focusing on the gold standard. What is a traditional consideration of what that might be? And then what is a more modernized perspective? And then we're going to jump into the various dimensions of a gold standard, the various levels of the tiered program, and how that really varies by the operation of the particular pilot that's undergoing training. And that is really central to elevating the gold standard. So let's go ahead and bring in the team here. So with me, we have Clark Otter McNeese, who's our VP of Executive Vice President of Standards. I keep saying flight operations. Well, that changed about a year ago, Otter, so I apologize for that. Why don't we go ahead and introduce our guests, Otter, and what we'll get started with is we'll go ahead and start with Todd. And if anybody wants to learn more about you and I, they can just go to those links by our name there at apstraining.com/Ransbury and McNeese. So over to you, Otter, for Todd.
Yeah, it's great to be here with everybody. Todd is the chief pilot of Richardson Aviation for the last 8 years. Prior to he's flying currently the G500 and 650. Prior to that, he was a Gulfstream demo pilot. And then prior to that, Marine Corps officer and aviator for 20 years in flying tactical as well as transport category type aircraft. His last tour was chief of staff out in Hawaii. So it's great to have him with us. He and much of his team has been through our APS program about 3 times. And they do an integrated program, not only doing on-aircraft training, but simulator-based as well. So it's great to have you, Todd.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Great. Well, I have the honor of introducing Jeff Wofford, somebody I just met a little while ago, right? What was that, Jeff? Like 20 years ago, 15 years ago?
Yeah.
Well, Jeff was part of the original group when we first had the Bombardier Leading Edge program way back when APS partnered Bombardier to deliver that program. But Jeff is currently right now, as he's the manager of the Flying W Aviation department, flying the PC-12. So I think that's an exciting, comfortable job for him. He really likes the PC-12, but he's also the past chairman of the MBAA Safety Committee, and also the past director of aviation and chief pilot for CommScope, where they operated, gosh, Jeff, King Airs, a wide variety of Lears and even Challengers that I don't have on here. And then Jeff is also the recipient of the Eugene Cernan Aviation Safety Award that gets issued by Bombardier year over year. Did I get that right, Jeff? Did you want to add anything else or clean that up?
No, that's pretty good. Yeah, I just was with CommScope a long time. Now I'm doing a gig with Pilatus and having a ball. And yeah, you pretty much hit the nail on the head.
I like it, a gig. I like that. That's good. When you're retired, you can say gig, right?
Exactly.
Excellent. Okay, guys. Well, back to our kind of agenda slide here. I think a lot of the folks online might be wondering, well, elevating the jet upset training standard. Well, why do we need a standard at all? And, why do we need to elevate it? Isn't the gold standard pretty obvious? Well, I think as we go through the presentation today, we're going to see that there's a wide diversity of opinions on that. So, Otter, let's start with you. Why Why do you feel like a mastery program is needed after the industry, the regulatory authorities have put out the ICAO manual on UPRT, we have EASA and the FAA and the advisory circulars? What's the importance of mastery from your perspective?
Well, I'll just speak to the basic fact, and that is literally any pilot with a commercial license and an aerobatic airplane. In fact, yeah, he didn't even have to have an aerobatic airplane. He could just do it in a normal category airplane and hang a shingle and say they teach UPRT. And so there's a tremendous number of cooks in the kitchen, shall we say. They're trying to brew the UPRT and what it should look like. Many of them haven't even read the latest guidance, which we've really only gotten in recent years. So we've got decades of non-regulatory input until only recent years. So we all believe here that it is critical that we address the life-saving issues in order to have an effective impact on safety.
And what I would add before we go to Jeff and Todd to add their perspective on this at a high level would be that I need to really stand on the platform for the regulators, because they really did their job. They put fantastic guidance in place for the industry. You know, that 5-year effort by the Royal Aeronautical Society leading to the ICAO manual on upset prevention recovery training, the decades of the airplane upset recovery training aid, the subsequent guidance, for example, by the FAA is one example, EASA and other regulatory authorities around the world. But for the FAA, for example, you know, at the air carrier level, Part 121, 123 extended envelope training, but more specifically, guidance for the entire industry on advisory circulars 120, 123, which is flight path management, which we would connect to awareness and prevention. Then we have advisory circular 120, 109, which is stall prevention and recovery training, and 120, 111, which is now upset prevention and recovery training. So there's a nice suite of resources out there. The problem, and the reason why we went down this path, and you're going to see the path that APS led starting in 2019, just before COVID, is regulatory authorities. Their strong suit is saying what to do. A little bit less so on how to do it or how to optimize it. And I think that's really where we felt like a mastery program was required, and putting additional standards in place, for example, like the Every Pilot in Control solution standards. So why don't we go to you, Jeff, and then you're coming up next here, Todd. Jeff, what are your thoughts on why a mastery program is even needed at all?
Well, I think it's essential. If you look at the last, say, 20 years in the evolution of UPRT, you go back into the early 2000s, as Otter mentioned, I mean, there was just a wide variety. Anybody that had an airplane and a commercial license could do what they consider to be UPRT. And we went through a lot of different things early on. And over the years, however, this has been refined to a much higher degree. And I think APS is the one that's really led the charge on that. And I think that by setting a standard, not only are you paying attention and participating with the regulatory issues, but you're providing a way to show what you got to do to be able to meet that requirement. And so I think having a standard is extremely important.
Cool. Todd, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. And just what BJ said, I think is having all of the authorities finally get behind this and push this forward, so the rest of us can then benefit from the sort of downrange effects that come from that has been immensely helpful to what Jeff said. I mean, 20 years ago, it wasn't even that. 5 years ago, you'd be in the simulator and you know, doing the stall series in a simulator, and the instructor's yelling at you because you're losing altitude. It was a frustrating thing back then, and what has been great is to see that all of that work of the regulatory authorities has trickled down to the training providers, and it's starting to gain more widespread traction. And APS absolutely has taken all of that effort and has focused it in a sort of deliberate and disciplined approach, which I think is very important, which we'll see in the slides coming up.
Hey,
Cool.
BJ,
Great. Yeah, go ahead, Otter.
before we move on, if you don't mind, I just want to remind the audience that, you know, how critical this is, that we do continue to press into this appropriate training, because the industry, upset training industry, has not done well in the past. It's led to not only accidents in the private industry, but in the airline industry as well. Inappropriate upset training there. So it's critical that we get it right.
No, absolutely. It's true. In fact, we always talked about in the the 5-year work we did with the 40 organizations, 80 experts around the world, Otter, is that numerous times I would stand up saying, look, it's better to do nothing than to do it wrong. Very easy to make the risk worse if we're not really careful here. The one thing I like to add, I think that Todd and Jeff, I think you had a very nice compliments to APS. I appreciate that. But one of our mandates in our business is saving lives. So transparency around what we learn and sharing that with the industry is a really big part of our culture and our mission at APS. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. And most importantly, everything we talked about is directly aligned with industry. So people going through regulatory training and upset prevention and recovery training, if it's being done in compliance with the existing standards, which unfortunately often it's not, if it is, then this program enhances that. It does not contradict it in any way. It's designed to complement, reinforce, and really enhance the overall implementation of UPRT. Okay, so real quick, if anybody's interested in learning more, there's a QR code up there at the top. You can get your phone out, take a screenshot, just rewind back to this part of the video, but you can also go to apstraining.com/UPRT-mastery. And you're going to hear as we go through this that really the different standards of bronze, silver, gold, and platinum are not just prescriptive. They're actually very much related to what, where, and how you operate as a pilot. So a solution for a single-engine Cessna pilot is much different than a multi-engine high-performance crewed Citation 10 pilot, for example. Okay, so here's the 4 levels that we have. And they do assume a couple things. They do assume that they're all being delivered in accordance with the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard, which we'll get a little bit later. They're also assuming that those different levels are focused on and being designed for how the pilot operates. But at the highest level, assuming those levels of standards are being implemented, we can kind of generally break down the bronze standard is the very best you can possibly do with a Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard aligned simulator training program. That's bronze. And in fact, you'll see when you see the risk mitigation that over the industry standard, which is what the vast majority of people are seeing, is when we implement that with power, for example, with somebody like Delta Airlines that did a 5 million flight 5-year study, that simulator mitigation reduced their precursor events by a full 50%. But it's because it was done in accordance with the standards we're going to talk about here today. So just doing a simulator program isn't bronze, but doing an optimized one does mitigate the threat, but not comprehensively, as we're going to talk about. The next one up, Otter, would be silver training and then the integrated training. Do you want to talk about those just a little bit as to why on aircraft is silver and then how integration is really where the gold standard lives?
Yeah, silver, we consider the on-aircraft training silver because there is more effective mitigation that can take place when a pilot is able to get airborne, especially in an all-attitude, all-envelope capable aircraft with an instructor that does follow the Every Pilot Control methodologies. And it's a very effective program there, but it's not comprehensive. If we can now take the pilot in training and give him the on-aircraft as well as the simulator based training, that's called the integrated approach, and that truly takes mitigation to a higher level.
And we're going to see that in upcoming diagrams. So if you're feeling like that's a little murky, it's not going to be. And in fact, I'm going to apologize right now for the amount of information we're going to be bringing to everybody on this call today. So kind of strap in and hang on. There's a lot of information. Might be rewinding it here today. But I think what Otter was alluding to is the reason why the silver standard is on aircraft training, because one of the most threatening areas to a pilot in a real world upset event is startle, surprise, and fear. They have to have the ability to overcome those incapacitating human factors that can really deny their ability to access the skills they have from simulator only training. It's very, very incapacitating and overwhelming. So, which is why the gold standard really is an integration of simulation and on aircraft. So, for example, on aircraft, As Otter talked about, your brain works differently in a real airplane than it does in a simulator. That's really the only place you can effectively mitigate and learn disciplines to be able to overcome the human factors of startle, surprise, and fear, to reliably get access to your skills. But it can't do certain things that the simulator does. For example, very low altitude airplane upsets, all weather upsets, night upsets. CRM is more effectively done in a traditional simulator that's all envelope capable. But neither one of those alone can be considered a full mitigation. They need to come together into the gold standards. Let me just pause there for a minute. So just so everybody's aware, is that Richardson Aviation is actually a Platinum Pro holder of the Mastery program. They go beyond the gold standard. But maybe, Todd, could you maybe talk a little bit about your perspective on the importance of integrating the training? You guys do the on-aircraft training and simulation with us during initial training, but you come back for recurrent doing on-aircraft with us, and then we come in to teach it type-specific on your simulator. Do you want to talk about how you feel like that's incredibly valuable?
Yeah, the program here. First of all, I would say that if anybody's out there just thinking about it, then my emphasis is just get started. So if it's the bronze piece of it, then do the bronze piece. But everything that's being said here is true. Is while that training is good and is invaluable, will help you, it's really just that first step on a long road. And from the simulator stuff, you can get in there and you can play with that, and you learn the techniques, and then you get on the aircraft and you bring in the seat of the pants feel of things, and then you go further, and now you integrate both the simulator and the airplane. You can bring those familiarities that can shift back and forth, one from the simulator to the airplane and back. And then we like to take a step further and actually do the training in our airplane. So as best as the simulator can mimic that, we have the controls that we have the displays with the HUD, everything that we would see if we ever got into one of those situations, that then we can draw back on all of those elements in the moment, because the startle, surprise, and fear is, in the Marine Corps, we used to call that STEM power. When this is not going to happen, when I'm flying with Otter, he's going to give me an upset. I know it's coming. He's already told me it's coming. When this is going to happen is going to be in the middle of the night, over the middle of the Atlantic, when you fly underneath, somebody's vortex, and your seat's kicked back, you got your leg up. That's when this is going to hit. And so when it does, you don't have time. And like we've said before, is putting the wrong controls in is even worse. So doing this on a routine basis, doing this on a deliberate basis, doing this on a disciplined basis, just builds that reaction up to where that first move that you make is the correct one every time. And that's when it's going to matter, is in the moment.
Cool. Jeff, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that an integrated program is essential. If you go back decades, for decades, the only thing we did even resembling this was what they termed unusual attitude recovery. And so day one in the sim, you'd do a nose up recovery, you do a nose low recovery, and that was basically it. And then I guess it's late 90s, early 2000s, CAE offered an advanced unusual attitude recovery if you were signed up, and then you signed up for it. And it went into a little more detail, but the problem is that really didn't address loss control in flight there very well. And so having an integrated program like this is absolutely essential. Obviously, there's some things you can do in a simulator that you can't do in the airplane. Again, you're not going to do it low level. You're not going to do it at night, IMC, that kind of thing. And then doing it on aircraft, there's nothing that replaces the response you get when Otter suddenly rolls you inverted or talks you into messing up yourself, and that can't be duplicated in a simulator. So having this integrated approach really makes a big difference in building this kind of proficiency and understanding in UPRT.
Awesome, guys. Okay, well, let's kick off. We're going to jump off the diving board here into some more details. So if anybody has any questions out there, remember, you can post them into the chat stream no matter what platform you're on. We're going to see them, and at the end during the Q&A, we're going to bring those in and talk to. So you don't need to wait. If the question comes up, put it in there. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation today. So one of the interesting things is that Not the most recent 10-year period reported by Boeing, but the previous one prior to that, is that 44% of all fatalities were associated with loss of control in flight. The most recent report is now 66% of all fatalities. So despite the very best efforts of the industry, we just need to recognize that the reason why that big red column exists is not because we're not trying hard. What's happening is we just have a fundamental deficiency in the training system overall that perpetuates the risk of loss of control in flight. And so really to overcome this, we need to institute a paradigm shift to take a different approach to training to bring that down. Now, the good news is without existing training, that column will be a whole lot worse, all right? So I'm not at all saying that our training we're doing now isn't effective, but it's doing the best it can within the limited scope of where traditional training is decided to operate. And Otter's going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's fundamentally incapacitated to do a whole lot about that. So yes, we need to continue our training. Yes, we need to continue working hard. Yes, we need to continue to evolve our regulatory guidance. But at the end of the day, the devil's in the details. It's all about implementing in an integrated fashion to give the skills and disciplines to be aware of and prevent these things from ever happening. Like we just saw Delta reduce this by 50% just by implementing a robust simulator program. But also, should you need to recover, you have that skill. So I will repeat here, the hallmark of an effective UPRT program, even when it's including recovery training, that recovery training is really building the mental model for the pilot to see a situation developing and stopping it before it happens in the first place. So from there, I'm teeing you up, Otter, for the next slide here, I believe. Let me just, before we do that, very often people think about the way platforms are implemented. So we've alluded to on-aircraft simulation and academics, and a little bit later, we're going to be talking about how to optimize those. But the reason why this circle is all red, it's being defined as red simply by the fact that loss of control in flight is the number one threat to air safety. So the paradigm shift requires us to further mitigate this. And the secret doesn't lie in the effective use of purpose-built platforms and effective instruction and other dynamics we're going to talk about in just a minute. So, Otter, we talked about how the industry is fundamentally limited to how much impact it can actually make on this just by design. And I think of the many, many, many dimensions of that, this particular concept here has always seemed to resonate with people to understand how much regulatory training misses. Do you want to go ahead and talk us through that?
Yeah, and I'd like to just emphasize this is just one aspect of why loss of control in flight is an issue for pilots, right? So we're just touching on one of the areas here, but this graph is just designed to kind of help us, especially as pilots, visualize the issues that we are dealing with, and especially how the regulatory environment has approached it. Now, this graph is a vertical and horizontal graph showing all attitudes that you can get in an airplane. Now, kind of disregard the little buttons on the side and the little aircraft reference symbol in the center there, saying the most important thing I want you to understand is this is a graph of all attitudes that you can get in an airplane. Now, if you were flying in your airplane and I plotted you in the center of this graph, that would mean you're in straight and level flight, all right? Now, if you begin to pitch up, all right, then you would be working your way up the vertical axis. And in fact, all the way at the top of the axis, you're now 90 degrees nose up. That's right. And if you were to pitch down, then you would be working your way down on the graph. If you were to end up in a bank, say to the right, any type of bank angle, all the way to inverted. There goes all the way to far right. And then, of course, any bank angle to the left is on the left side. So I hope everybody can see how this graph works to show us how you could plot an airplane in any attitude. All right. Now, the green box you're looking at right now is showing what's defined for a transport category jet, the parameters which outside of these pitch and bank angles that this green box is showing would define it as an upset. All right, so you got to be more than 25 degrees nose up, more than 10 degrees nose down, and greater than 45 degrees angle of bank. All right, so most all of us flying jet transport category airplanes are trying to keep our airplane clearly within inside this box, and in fact, many times even a smaller box than this there. but it only represents about 5% of all attitudes that you can get in an airplane. Now, when we went through training as pilots and we were flying in our, Cessnas or Pipers or whatever, normal category airplanes, we were actually only able to explore an additional 6% of the attitudes that you could get in an airplane. So up to no more than 60 degrees of bank or 30 degrees of pitch there. So that leaves roughly 90% of all attitudes that you could get in an aircraft that most pilots have never had a chance to experience in training, and certainly in training in a real airplane under the tutelage of a qualified UPRT instructor. And the problem is, if a pilot does end up out in the red, which you could end up out in the red very easily in a matter of seconds due to a wake turbulence, for instance, now the conditions become abnormal, they become time critical, the cueing is unfamiliar and even unexpected for the pilot. Even the skills that he learned to keep his airplane in those smaller boxes now actually don't apply, and they're counterintuitive. And the instructing techniques that he learned, or the instructor that taught him, didn't even have the skill set himself to teach the proper technique there. So in other words, the skills are absent there. And of course, the psychophysiological state of the pilot becomes altered. All right. You're no longer that calm, cool, collected Chuck Yeager you were a few seconds ago there. And now you are struggling to regain control.
And this is one of those diagrams, Otter, we could spend an entire session on, right? I think you did a fantastic job sharing that. So I think one of the interesting things here as we look at this is and you made a good point, is that the skills in the red, the correct skills do transfer into the middle, but the skills that we have in the middle, the green and the orange, do not transfer to the red. In fact, we are completely unprepared, if not making the situation immediately worse, like Todd mentioned earlier. That initial wrong reaction could really make it going from bad to worse to unrecoverable very, very quickly. So, Jeff, any thoughts on this? I know you've seen this before we move on. This is just kind of setting up as to why that big red column is there by design almost from the training system.
Yeah. So I was very fortunate in that in my career, I flew a lot of different airplanes, and I had the opportunity to do some aerobatics. And so I really didn't, I sort of took it for granted that, a lot of other people did the same thing. But I really had sort of a aha moment. I guess it was in 2003 at CAE. I'd gone down for recurrent training in the Lear 55. And I went down by myself, so I had another company's pilot in the sim with me. And we had signed up for that advanced unusual attitude recovery program at the end of the recurrent. And so they put us in a wake turbulence event, and it basically rolled me upside down. I did the recovery and ended up, executing a miss and coming back and landing. And so I did it a couple times. And when the other pilot did it, when he got rolled inverted, he pulled and basically tried to do a split S and not successfully. And so when the instructor tried explaining to him what was going on, he really didn't understand it. He'd never been in that position before. And it really dawned on me that there was this huge deficiency in some of our training. So we went ahead and I helped explain what was going on. And after a couple more times, he was successfully recovering the airplane. But he didn't have that experience. He didn't have that in his toolkit. And so with a little extra training, he got used to it. And so I really realized at that point that we had to do something in my department to address these issues, because depending on what pipeline you come up, if you don't come up in the military or you're not a CFI, you don't even do spins, and stall recovery is not enough. And so in the early 2000s, I started looking for a solution to this, and then we just happened to get into the leading edge program as you described earlier. And I sent all of our guys through UPRT with APS, and this provides an essential skill set that all of us, professional pilots, even private pilots, need to have You actually have a training center not too far from you guys that they're introducing UPRT in private pilot training. And I think that's something that we've got to do if we truly want to make a difference in our industry, because there's just so many people that never see this happen to them. Life in the red just doesn't normally happen. They're used to being in the green, and they've never been in that area. That's that vastly large area that is outside their realm of normal operations. So, going out and going through a formal UPRT program with a focus on the P, but also understanding the R is going to be the thing that makes a difference in our industry.
That's great, Jeff. And I think you're referring to United Aviate Academy, and they do, in fact, implement the gold standard UPRT
Exactly.
program. And I believe they're the only flight school I'm aware of that does that. Todd, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll just, my entire aviation learning experience was in the military. So when I got out and started talking to civilian guys is when I started to learn how the civilian pipeline works and how guys get trained and what they do and what they see. And I was always, I was told we do stall training, which I just then translated to what we did, stall training. And then in a conversation, just sort of offhand, a comment was made that, you can't stall an airplane upside down, which kind of frightened me a little bit. So I started digging a little bit deeper on what is exactly the process that pipeline teaches from, in that red area, right? That red area is, 90% of all the possible situations an airplane can find itself in, but it's 0.01% of the time for most pilots are in that, if that. And so as I started digging, I started to talk to guys and find out just exactly what it was. I realized there was no structure to it. It was what that CFI knew, what that CFI was comfortable with. I've talked to folks that have said, well, my CFI didn't really like to do stalls, so we just took it to stick shaker or to the horn, and then we were done. And I was like, well, so much like Jeff, and at that point, that's when I kind of decided that we need to take this a whole step further and get that, because it's a hazard. That's a big red bar that you saw earlier. The only way in my mind to address anything like that is through training and through knowledge. And you got to have a distinct program. So that's when I found APS. I was ignorant on the entire industry up till 6 years ago. So I'm happy I found and we found a home there, and I've seen a dramatic improvement in the guys, both in their comfort in that if they ever do find themselves out in that red area, getting it back into the green very, very quickly.
And I think one of the things to mention, and maybe Otter, I know we have a lot to go through here, but what we find, it was interesting. Many years ago, I was doing a presentation in Singapore. In fact, Randy just landed in Singapore, Otter, by the way. I just saw that. I gave a presentation, and there was a representative from the FAA up there. And after I got done, and she said, BJ, you're actually promoting the wrong thing. You should be promoting manual flight operation proficiency, because UPRT really helps everybody every minute of every flight all day long to be more aware of the flight envelope, recognize where they are, and to understand what's happening in aviation. And so I realized that, and that was really the genesis of the AC 120-123 flight path management, is what is central to effective upset training on the awareness and prevention is flight envelope awareness, flight path management as well. Otter, anything else you want to add on this? We probably should move on.
Well, I'll just add that one of the reasons why this is a training problem, loss of control in flight is a training problem. It's not a technology problem, and is because the vast majority of loss of control in flight accidents, the primary flight controls, ailerons, rudder, and elevator, were still operating normally. Mm-hmm. And yet the pilots failed to use them properly to either prevent or recover from the upset.
Yeah.
So
it is. I mean, there's very, very few airplane upset or fatal accidents where it's actually a control failure. There's something wrong with the airplane. It really is. And those are usually labeled as system component or system component failures, right? Non-power plant is how they're labeled in the charts. Okay, let's go really quickly through this. So the building blocks of a mastery program. So it requires a few layers. So first of all, like we mentioned earlier, is that any UPRT program, and sadly a lot don't, absolutely must be grounded in the regulatory guidance. As we mentioned earlier, it is excellent. Here's some of them listed here. The next one is we feel, which is the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard. There's a link there if people want to learn about it, is really the provider itself needs to be optimized. It has to have the right kind of instructors. It has to promote integration. It has to have the right amount of intensity on the various platforms to affect the outcome and change necessary. It not only has to meet regulatory guidance, but also regulatory best practices. Otter, I think of the IATA guidance on the best practices of implementing upset prevention and recovery training is excellent, but it largely gets ignored by providers out there. Then, of course, purpose-built platforms. You mentioned earlier, Otter, you can read those regulations and come to the conclusion you don't need an aerobatic airplane. But we're here to tell you, you have to have all envelope, all attitude exposure, and the risk of it during the training to truly build those capabilities. So the next one is that in a mastery program, the program just can't be regulatory compliant. It just can't be an optimized provider. The program itself needs to be designed around what, where, and how the pilot operates. So I mentioned earlier that the program for a single-engine Cessna pilot flying, or single-engine piston Cessna pilot flying VFR only, is a very, very different program than the multi-engine high-performance crewed operator flying at high altitude. And so it's important that the program is designed around that. And then to what Todd is talking about, and Jeff as well, is that really it's something that atrophies, it declines over time. And so it really requires recurrent training every 2 to 3 years. We recommend every year. Most flight departments select 2 years, some 3, some do it once and done, but it truly is not a one and done thing, unfortunately. Okay, so now what we're going to talk about, under the assumption that all those layers are in place, how do we optimize the use of platforms to be able to drive down this risk to affect that paradigm shift that we talked about? So in the earlier slide, we saw a piece of pie that was all red. What we want to do is fill it in with compliant training to eliminate as much of that red as we possibly can. And each piece of the pie drives the arrow down further and further. Anything to add here, Otter? I know we're trying to get through this. Did you want to comment on this and anything?
Well, I just thought maybe it'll touch on the size of these pieces of the pie, because they're trying to replicate the value that platform brings to the whole mitigation piece or pie itself. And you can see the dark blue on aircraft. And we do feel because of the human factors training that you can get and really only get in an actual aircraft, it's one of the largest mitigating platforms. And that's why it's so large. The simulator is the next largest piece. Academics are certainly a contributor there. And we have a small sliver there, orange, which is VR or virtual reality. And we employ that here as well. And there is value that comes from that. Is just not as large as the other platform.
Yeah, and I would add that, we have what are called the quantitative loss control mitigation criteria that help us define what the contributing areas were. That's another presentation completely. You can go look at that. But the point is that any UPRT program fundamentally has to be grounded in academics and the proper theory to understand what's going on. And from there, building on aircraft simulation. And VR is really a better term for the VR would be type-specific training, because there is a role for type-specific training that really is important, because even though type-specific UPRT, unique to how that airplane operates, might be only 5%, that 5% that's type-specific can be all the difference between recovering and not. The point of this chart is the fact that a large portion of effective upset prevention recovery training is transferable across fixed-wing airplanes. And that's really the overall message here. But we can't ignore the value of type-specific training. Even Todd talked about how they bring APS in to teach in their actual type-specific level D simulator to ensure that's covered off optimally. And that's true. Often folks don't have that option. And so while they're here, we use virtual reality training to transfer that environmental skill and awareness into their platform. Okay. All right. So let's jump into it, guys. I know that's always the time is ticking here. And this, unfortunately, is going to be the eye chart that we're going to get through. And we're going to go through it. But this really in one place shows what the gold standard is, or where the bronze, silver, gold, and platinum live. So along the top, it's hard to read, but the red represents essentially marginally mitigated risk. The gray now represents academics, the dark blue on aircraft, the light blue simulation, and then the orange is virtual reality or type-specific UPRT. So what we're talking about here is that arrow keeps showing up, right? Remember, the arrow represents the paradigm shift in driving down the risk of loss of control in flight. So it's all red on the left, that big left bar, that 6% of all fatalities is on the left side, which is really the industry condition right now. And we're going to proceed to push it down into the green. So from a risk management standpoint, it's going from an intolerable risk to an acceptable risk is one way to look at it. Okay, so we're going to go left to right. We're going to see the industry standard where everybody is largely at now with industry's training. And again, fundamentally by design, it's doing the best that it can. Unless there is a paradigm shift, it's probably not going to be able to perform much greater than it is there. So we talked about bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. So hopefully all of those are familiar terms to you. Now, it's all red on the left of those pieces of pie. And because of the chart we talked about, you can see on the bottom, the red bar represents a threat that needs to be mitigated, even though those pieces of pie are being optimally mitigated to the best capability of the industry in our judgment, and which is telegraphed and very evidenced by the threat. We need to consider it red at this point if we want to be able to propagate through this process. So as part of the solution, moving from left to right, it requires the integration of the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard, the optimized implementation of instructors, of integrated training, intensity, best practices, and platforms to arrive at a risk management for the flight department that takes them in the bottom right now from the existing risk, which when you plot it out, which is another webinar we've done before, is that loss of control is almost always fatal and catastrophic. And by looking at ICAO definitions, it actually meets the definition of remote, which means rarely occur but is known to happen. The existing risk of the vast majority of operators is actually, by this example by ICAO, an intolerable risk. So the goal is to drive down that risk through integrated training into the acceptable risk area. So intolerable risk must be mitigated. You can't continue the operation theoretically according to SMS principles without it. You can mitigate it down to a tolerable risk, which requires a management decision, then into an acceptable risk. So let's go ahead and start from left to right.
Hey,
we see now. Yep, go ahead. Go ahead, Otter.
Click that. Let me just say, and maybe a different way, because I want to make sure the audience is clear. Jeff, back me up on this here. That red circle, everybody, that we're looking at, that is representing what we believe is the current state of the industry as it relates to being able to mitigate the loss of control and flight threat. Right. The industry is using simulators. The industry is using airplanes and academics and all that. But right now, it is simply not effective enough to have that paradigm shift that we're trying to promote.
So as we move from left to right, you'll see now as we integrate these optimally implemented academics and simulation, for example, like Delta Airlines is doing, boy, there's big chunks of red that are going away. In the silver, there's big chunks of red that are going away with on-aircraft training, but the gold standard really lives in the integration where you can see that we're mitigating a diversity of risks. So, for example, the on-aircraft portion of that for the single, the single engine piston VFR only operator could very well be accomplished in an on-aircraft piston program, like an all extra 300 program. But for the business jet crewed operator operating at high altitude, that on-aircraft pie requires not only probably the piston on-aircraft training, but also now training in the jet and training at high altitude in a complex airplane environment. And then as we move to the right, it needs to be designed around them. So the Platinum Standard integrates type-specific and expanded academics. But for today, we're doubling down on the gold standard. Boy, that is a mouthful, and that's a big eye chart, and I kind of went through it quickly. Let's just pause here, guys, before we move on, because this is one of those things where people are like, okay, that's too much for me. But this really is how you can understand the process of the paradigm shift and how we can mitigate this risk and drive it down. We looked at SMS principles. We looked at paradigm shift principles. We looked at a piece of the pie. We looked at risk contribution and mitigation. Otter, give us your words of wisdom on that to help the folks maybe understand what the overall goal is this, because you had to teach this actually to our own company and our own pilots to understand the training that they were delivering, right? Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, and you're talking about, I'm sorry, referring just to the standards themselves?
Well, actually, this whole process of going from left to right and mitigating the risk.
From a historical standpoint, it's been a learning process for us as well to see the value of each of the platforms and how they get mitigated there. And I apologize. I don't know if that's what you're asking. Sorry.
No, that's fine, Otter. No, I was just wanting you to maybe to explain, the challenges you had for our own instructors to understand the power of what they're implementing based on whether it's simulator only, on aircraft only, or the integration. Because in their mind, they know everybody needs integration, but breaking it down into a way for pilots themselves that don't live in this industry to understand is why we come up with these conceptual pictures and why we are sharing this with the industry to help understand that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. Even for a UPRT provider, the instructor that is doing this full time, sometimes it's hard for them to relay just verbally. And so using pictures to help see the value of what they're doing really helps in the communication. And this has been an evolution and process for us.
Go ahead, Jeff and Todd. I can see you want to comment there. Jump in.
Yeah, so I think one thing you've glanced around it a couple times, but one of the things about this integrated program that's extremely important to point out is not only the academics that's involved that goes along with the on-aircraft and simulator-based training, but the probably the most important part are the instructors. One of the problems we've had for a long time is just the average instructor, whether they're one of the training providers in a simulator or whatever, they don't have the skills to be able to efficiently and effectively teach UPRT because they've not been through a program that's got all the details, the academics and everything else. And so this is a unique skill set, not only from a pilot perspective, but for an instructor. And so the key to making this successful is having really good, competent instructors. And so having a great set of instructors, having a great program, having the academics, the on-aircraft and simulator, this entire integrated program is what makes a big difference. And like I said, having that all come together in one piece, and I think that's very, very well demonstrated in this picture. When you start out on the left looking at the red circle, and then by the time you get all the way over to the right, where you've used all these mitigation strategies and this program, by putting all this together, is you're able to mitigate most of the risk that you have with upsets.
So these are on our walls on our debriefing rooms, Todd. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're in there for people to understand, where they are. So the mastery program, let's say for somebody goes through just on aircraft training, which is great. If that's to Todd's point, get started somewhere, come back for recurrent, fill in the pieces of pie that you missed and continue to mitigate the risk as you move through the process. You don't have to do everything all up front, although that's ideal. You can build through this process, just start mitigating this risk in some fashion. Todd, over to you for thoughts.
Yeah, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I guess when I said that, just get started, that's more of there are real world considerations for companies, right? That all this takes money and all that. That's kind of what I was getting at, is that even if it's just a building block piece, every little bit helps to get going. Obviously, in an ideal world, we just jump right over to platinum and get it all at once. I may have seen these. I don't remember, BJ. If I think Otter was yelling at me, so I didn't get a chance to read the stuff on the wall. But the first time I've actually looked at them for real is today, and this maps perfectly sort of my experience over the last 5 years with it. And that kind of start at the beginning to what Jeff was saying on the instructor piece. Like right now, the industry standard, that's where we live today. That simulation piece, if you want to call UPRT and what we do in the simulators now with the unusual attitudes and all that kind of stuff, often with instructors that don't understand, they don't have the academic background to be able to. So even though you're doing it in the simulator, you're still in that red box, which I think is important to identify. But when we go through, we went through, did the extra in the initial training, and then we did not do the simulators. We did the on-aircraft stuff, which was fantastic. You learn the sort of hows, and you get the seat of the pants and all that kind of stuff. And then you jump in the next time we did the simulator, and you do the simulator, and it's like, oh my goodness, now we're doing an IMC and we're doing it closer to the ground. And you have all these other considerations that I could draw on from my on-aircraft stuff in the simulating world. And then the expanded academics piece where, the simulator and the on aircraft is teaching you the how. The academics is important. I can't overemphasize how important it is to understand the why you're doing what you're doing.
Mhm.
And when you all of a sudden wrap all that stuff together and you do a couple cycles, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, now it's seamless. And which I love about that colored circle on the platinum is there are no more, well, there's that little red in there, which is always, I don't know if you're ever going to get rid of all of it, but you can jump. You seamlessly transition from simulator to on aircraft to academics and vice versa. So this is a great diagram, I think, that explains the importance of the sort of comprehensive and integrated program.
Well, I think you made a good point there, Todd. One of the reasons why we say no more than 3 years for recurrent is because people have lost the why after 3 years. Even though we ingrain, push, roll, power, stabilize, and they can do that and wake up in the middle of the night, after a while, the academic connection, the theoretical understanding as to why that's being done starts getting lost. So after 3 years, we recommend a reinitial for the reasons you talked about. Anything to add here, Otter, before we move on?
No, it's great.
Okay. So
Thanks.
there's where the medallions live right there, folks, across those levels.
Mhm.
Okay, so what does the jet upset training gold standard look like? So what does that piece of pie look like? Well, on aircraft, depending on your type of operation, 6 to 8 hours, which needs to cover off all the critical content of the regulatory academics and align and prepare you for the practical training. On aircraft training for a jet operator is 2 piston. Also, they're compliant with the Epic S2 and Pro, typically 2 piston flights, 2 jet flights, complex jet, all attitude, one of those at high altitude, advanced simulation, depending on your operation, 1 to 4 hours of class specific, and then 35 to 45 minutes of type specific, and then a recurrent training program. So that's what it looks like for a gold standard. And so that really, we feel now from a gold standard standpoint, you're not leaving any stone unturned when it comes to risk mitigation. The platinum is essentially doubling down with that on recurrent training, expanded academics to better understand the why, and really being focused on type specific transition of skill sets. But at the end of the day, today's conversation is about elevating the gold standard. So it used to be, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is that we would have conversations and people will say, no, I do the gold standard because I do an on-aircraft upset training program. Well, the question is, okay, well, there's a large part of the mitigation that's being not addressed or the risk not addressed. And is that on-aircraft training related to how you operate? If you're a jet operator and it's all piston, it's leaving too many stones unturned. You need to further mitigate that risk of complexity in high altitude operations. So the UPRT program should really meet you where you're at and how you operate and where you operate as a professional pilot. So comments, guys, on this? Todd, anything on this then to Jeff?
No, I think that you said it all. I've got nothing further to add to what you said.
Jeff, I know you were chuckling there a minute ago. Did you want to add what you were thinking?
No, I just, like I said, I think, yeah, it was like the funny thing hit me is there's a movie Pirates of the Caribbean, and they're trying to explain the girl in the movie was talking about how she was wanting to invoke a parlay, and she said that's part of the pirate code. He says, well, it's really not so much a law, it's a suggestion, or and I think that's what we've got to think about. So we've got people talk about standards, and they throw this out and go, yeah, we operate at a gold standard. Well, what is it? Well, we do what we're supposed to do. Well, no, that's not a gold standard. And so I think that by setting very specific standards that people can follow and people can understand makes a big difference. And so, I think I saw a presentation Tony Kern did several years ago. If we set the bar low enough, everybody's exceptional. And I think when it comes to aviation, we need to learn to set the bar higher and higher. And so when you have a gold standard, it should mean something. And so by setting this gold standard and having these requirements, spelled out, that takes the guesswork out of it. And so when somebody says, hey, yeah, I do operate at a gold standard, and they say, well, how do you determine that? They can go right down the list and say, well, I do this, 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 and this. That's how you make a difference.
And Jeff, you're flat out saying that the FAA minimums is not the gold standard, right?
Absolutely. I don't mean to pick on the FAA. The FAA does a great job. I'm a member of the FAA safety team, and so I have to deal with a lot of the stuff they go through. but what the FAA requires are minimum standards. And I think we were talking yesterday, and I made the comment, if you're going to go get brain surgery, do you want to get the guy that graduated at the bottom of the class, or do you want to get the guy that's number one? Personally, I would want to go with number one. So, like I said, this goes back to when I first started flying. One of my instructors told me, Jeff, he said, when you walk into the airplane and you hang a left, you're responsible for everybody that goes in and hangs a right and sits down behind you. You're also responsible for everybody on the ground. He said, if you can't take that responsibility seriously, then you need to go back and do what you were doing in the Navy. And so that's one of the things I've always thought about. And so UPRT is part of that responsibility, part of that setting this bar high enough to make sure that we're trying to be the best we can possibly be and not be stuck down at minimum standards. And so that's why this is so important.
And I'll add into that too, like to the standard, like to what you said, Otter, like it's by definition, the 6158 check, right, that the FAA puts us through is the minimum standard. And you can probably pull out a lot of different parts of that check that we in the industry strive to do a lot better than what is required when we go do that FAA check ride to get that approved. And I think the argument here that we're making today is that UPRT should be no different.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, guys, we're getting near to the end of our time, and we do have a question I want to share to wrap things up today. Let's just go to the room here, and let's go ahead and bring it in. And this is coming in from Nick. Very interesting. A lot we could all probably say on that. Isn't the risk of on-aircraft training greater than risk of actually encountering unusual attitudes? Spinning was taken out of the UK private pilot syllabus for this reason. More accidents occurred in training spinning than accidents involved inadvertent spinning. So, Otter, any thoughts on that? Well, these guys think about that. This is where you wish Rich Stoll was in here so he could just jump all over this one, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. He would have a heyday with this one. But I'll just say, too, that that's simply no excuse because, again, we're still talking a training issue here. The CFIs need this. The CFIs are not qualified there. I'm sorry to say that our current CFI spin endorsement here in the United States is well, I'm just going to say lame at best there. So, BJ, I know you can talk to this from a statistic standpoint.
Well, I think that, when we think back just recently, the ATR 72 spinning in, right? I mean, how many deaths are worth doing training correctly, right? But let's not go down that road. But I think the nice thing, for example, like the United Aviate Academy Otter from a spin training standpoint, is in their UPRT program, their gold standard program, as they do the CFI spin endorsement as part of it. And it's very comprehensive. It's multiple flights. They have the academic training. They have to demonstrate instructional capability in the airplane and actually in the classroom as well. So it's a much greater mitigation of this. So
and can I just,
Jeff, go ahead, jump in there on.
Can I just add real quickly, and then Jeff, and that is, first of all, just remember too that spin training is not UPRT. All right, it's an aspect of UPRT there. So go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah. So to answer Nick's question, no, I think the risk of not doing UPRT is what the problem is. And I think as far as spin training being taken out of curriculum, it was taken out of the, FAA requirements as well. The problem is that the instructors teaching it weren't competent. We have some deficiencies in our whole pilot certification program. And again, I'm not picking on the FAA, but if you have a really good instructor and a really good student, you produce a really good pilot. If you have a really good student and a so-so instructor, there's only so much you can do. If you have a so-so instructor and a so-so student, guess what? It rapidly goes downhill. And so we have a self-defeating system if we're not careful. And so the problem is that we had people teaching spins that really weren't prepared to teach spins, and people got into trouble, and they would try to take a 152 into 6 or 8 turns and might not be able to get out of it. So I think that again, it goes back to let's set this bar high enough to where we're being the best we can possibly be, and that means better training. It means more comprehensively trained instructors. And again, I think what United Aviate's doing is addressing a lot of these issues, and I hope to see Embry-Riddle and some of the other big flight training centers, implement this as well.
So the one thing I would add, for example, in the United States, and I see Mark Greenfield commented in Europe, is the fact that to effectively implement regulatory upset prevention recovery training, we have a location in Europe as well. The instructors are required to go through an instructor training program. So they have the competencies and capabilities to be able to do that. Now, in many areas of the world, that's pretty limited. It's not very robust. But for example, in the airline industry here, for example, like United and Delta Airlines that we license with our program, very robust training. So they're teaching in ways that's going to overall mitigate the risk. The only other thing I would mention, I've heard this presented in the Royal Aeronautical Society, was this. So those 750 people that died there bore the risk of the pilots not having the training to mitigate that threat. So let's say, for example, that 750 pilots died in training, learning to be a competent pilot. Well, their job is risk management. But if that training would save the traveling public from bearing the burden of that risk, then essentially, technically, it would be worth it. Now, I'm not saying it's the right way to say that, but the point of it is the biggest threat here we see in commercial operations in particular is why should the traveling public bear the burden of the inadequate training of the pilots and the crew? Crews should be trained effectively and properly to keep the traveling public safe. So it's the burden of training on the pilot as experts and professionals to have the proper training to deal with and mitigate any recoverable or avoidable situation that they can encounter in flight. So with that, guys, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Why don't we go to Todd, any final comments? And Jeff, then Otter, then we'll head out.
No, that last little conversation I think was good. Was that if we wanted to be safe, we would just wrap the airplanes in Cosmoline and put them in the hangar. But we can't do that. We have to operate them. And just like we talked about before, that one of the original charts, that 90% of the places you can put that airplane, they only happen 0.01% of the time, and that's I'm totally pulling that number out, but it's a very small percentage amount of the time that we're outside of that green and maybe yellow parts. But that doesn't then remove the responsibility for us as professional aviators to understand what it means when and if we ever get into that regime, and that's where the importance of the training and everything that they said about the right instructors, the right equipment, the right process, all that matters. But we have to continue to do that training and address it.
Jeff?
Well, I guess in a nutshell, I'll put it like this. I think UPRT is like insurance. You hope you never need it, but if you ever do need it, you want to make sure you got the best. And so when you need it and find out you don't have it, that's when you got problems.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Otter, final words of wisdom for everybody before we wrap?
I just want to thank the whole audience, especially Nick there, for giving us that question. He made a good comment about his experience there. Mark Greenfield, it was great to hear from you. Thanks. And thank you both, Todd and Jeff. It's great to see you again.
Yes, thank you, guys. Jeff, Todd, taking time out of your very busy schedules to be here. We really appreciate it and bringing your practical real-world experience and kind of living the process we talked about today. So thank you for your time, and everybody out there that is with us here live and watching the recording, which will be online for many, many years to come. Thank you for taking time to go through this process. But to the general point we have is that the regulatory minimums are that. Seek out to and expect training to overcome that threat of loss of control, because we should not accept that unnecessary risk of loss of control when we have something that we can do about it. And there's many organizations and providers out there that can help you. So please seek that out. So guys, thank you very much. We'll see you next time and appreciate your time today, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.